Hello, everybody, and welcome. We are so thrilled that you could join us today for On Poetry and Our Neurodiverse Future. My name is Alex Elliott, and I'm the Senior Manager of Events and Engagement for the Public Programs Department of California Institute of Integral Studies, which is a nonprofit university located in San Francisco. As many of us are descendants of settlers, immigrants, or descendants of those forcefully brought to this continent, we, CIIS Public Programs, must recognize and never forget that our university's building in San Francisco occupies traditional, unceded Ramaytush Ohlone lands. If you're interested in learning more about Native lands, languages, and territories, we encourage you to visit native-land.ca. Now let me first introduce our presenters, Chris Martin and Nick Walker, and then we will get right to their conversation. Nick Walker is a queer, transgender, flamingly autistic writer and educator, best known for her foundational work on the neurodiversity paradigm and neuroqueer theory. Dr. Walker is a core faculty member in the undergraduate psychology program here at CIIS, a lifelong Zen practitioner, senior Aikido instructor at the Aiki Arts Center in Berkeley, co-creator of the Weird Luck webcomic, and author of the book Neuroqueer Heresies. Chris Martin is this very moment endeavoring to become himself, a some, many, and tilted thinking animal who sways, hags, loves, trees, lights, listens, and arrives. He is a poet who teaches and learns in mutual measure as the connective hub of unrestricted interest/tilt and the curator of Multiverse, a series of neurodivergent writing from Milkweed Editions. His most recent book of poems is Things to Do in Hell, and his first book of nonfiction, May Tomorrow Be Awake, on poetry, autism, and our neurodiverse future, will be released by Harper One this year. And now, it is my absolute pleasure to turn it over to Nick and Chris.
Chris, hello.
Hello, how are you?
Welcome. Oh, very good. Well, it has been a long time since you and I got to have a conversation. And the last time we had a conversation, neither of us had published a book, and now we both have. So that's very exciting.
And I noticed that even in my bio, I still hadn't published a book. It's fresh.
Yes.
The press.
I have your book right here.
And I have to say, yeah, you have the special advanced. And
I do. I have the advanced uncorrected proof, it says.
Yeah.
Well, if I find any errors, I won't tell anyone.
We're good.
Oh, and you got my book there too. Cool.
Right.
Yeah. Well, congratulations, first of all. And let's talk a little bit about this book. So you work teaching poetry. You teach poetry writing. And that's mostly what this book is about. Your experiences teaching poetry writing, specifically, largely to non-speaking autistic writers. And so I would just love to start out, hearing about that. How did you get started on that?
Yeah, I mean, it was a long process, and it began somewhat haphazardly, I would say. When I was a baby poet living in New York, I wanted to teach in the schools, and I got a job at an after-school program in South Brooklyn, and this is in 2003. And I ended up being kind of a utility player there, where I was teaching comic book design and a class on like rap composition, and I coached girls basketball. And when the other teaching artists were having difficulty integrating students into their classes, sometimes the director would just have me hang out with them, and my first instinct was to do poetry. And I only learned kind of later that they were autistic. And I didn't really know much about autism at the time. And so, you know, I feel like in retrospect, that was actually a really good thing, because the prevailing, ideas at the time would have forged, created a real wedge between me and these students because of what I wanted to do with them and what I imagined they were capable of. And there was one student in particular who was just incredibly passionate about the Planet of the Apes, the original Planet of the Apes movie. And so we, I tried to engage him with some like traditional forms, and it just like wasn't working. And so finally it was like, okay, well, why don't we like write a poemization of the film? Like, you tell me the film and I'll act as your like amanuensis, and I'll ask questions and like we can figure it all out. And he just went for it. And over the period of weeks, he completed his epic Planet of the Apes poemization. And I loved it so much. I was so excited about it just on the level of art. And so we decided to bring it to his teachers, his kind of day teachers. The director thought it might be enlightening. And so I came early one day and met with them, and we passed it out, and I was just kind of glowing, and they had this very strange response where they were like a little bit befuddled, a little bit awestruck. One teacher was even crying, and I was so confused about what was going on. And it took me many years to kind of piece together, after working with many other students and understanding what their experiences in school had been like, that these teachers were, really taking in that moment how little they had been able to reach the imaginative breadth of where this student was at, and perhaps their concept of his humanity had been lacking until that moment. But so that got me hooked. And that's one of the reasons why our organization is called Unrestricted Interest, because it was clear that these so-called restrictive interests with abnormal intensity were exactly the perfect place to start. And that as poets, we could just take some time to revel in whatever that passion or area of devoted study might be, and then we could kind of move from there and discover new territory. But it was only within the last 6 years that I started working with non-speaking autistic writers, and that was kind of like a quantum leap in some ways around this, what I was finding to be this really amazing reciprocity between poetry and autism and autistic individuals. And one of the things I'd begun to notice that, like, to kind of, when I had to explain it to people, because when I started the organization, of course, people were so like, this makes no sense to me. Like, first of all, autistic people are only supposed to be good at like STEM subjects, right? And then two, like, poetry is the most complicated and alienating thing in the world. How does that make sense? And so, it was an education for me, and just like how much both of these, like, in some ways, art forms, being autistic and writing poetry, were just so poorly understood. And so I had to like bridge that gap for people. And I would say that that in my experience, autistic life is deeply patterned, and it's sensory rich. And for me, that's the best kind of poems, are like thoughtfully, creatively patterned, carefully patterned, and then sensory, immense sensory detail. And so when I first started working with non-speaking autistic writers, I noticed that was ratcheted up even a little bit more. And beyond that, their particular approach to language was really as unmasked as it gets.
Mhm.
And that's something I've been thinking about a lot lately, is like just how much we mask our language, or maybe aren't even given the opportunity to discover what our language is, how we would use language if given the opportunity, and weren't just conditioned into these particular modes. And a lot of these writers I work with, you know, a lot of them had to wait a long time for the communication supports to express themselves, but they developed patterns and particularities with language that are just so startling. You know,
Beautiful, beautiful. So in terms of communication supports, and this is something that I think a lot of people are unaware of, that has shifted in a big way in the world over the past, maybe a couple decades,
yeah,
because it used to be that when an autistic person couldn't speak, they were called nonverbal,
right.
and meaning they can't use words. And in retrospect, that seems very ironic, because of course when you give the proper communication supports and the ability to type and such, they can't speak, but are often extremely gifted with words.
Yeah.
They're highly verbal. It's just not spoken. And what we're finding now in terms of the, as the research increases on autism and the neurology of it and such, what we're seeing is often the lack of oral speech is just a motor control issue. And for so many decades, really, there was this assumption that they were defective mentally, that if an autistic person couldn't speak, they must be lacking in intelligence and incapable of understanding language, really not relating to their verbal sphere or the sphere of communication and agency at all. And it was very dehumanizing, this presumption of incompetence. And one of the slogans of the autistic rights movement, especially among non-speaking autistic activists, has been presume competence. And we're really seeing that, okay, they're not nonverbal, they're just non-speaking. And I still see, I still encounter people using this archaic term nonverbal, and I generally correct it when I see it. Yeah. But that, I guess, brings me to the question. I mean, part of what's happened is the sort of work that you're doing, bringing the words of non-speaking autistic people out into the world, and supporting that, offering venues for publication, just but some of that involves advances in technology, and that can mean electronic technology or just even technologies in terms of new clever ways we come up with doing things. So I'd love to hear a little more about that, in terms of what sort of communication supports do your students use? Like, what is it? What are the methods and equipment and such that allow a non-speaking autistic person to get their words out onto paper, into print?
Yeah. Yeah, I want to thank you for making that distinction with nonverbal and non-speaking. And that's one of the things I love about your book, Neuroqueer Heresies, is that it's such incredibly practically useful resource guide to language and to the importance of distinctions when it comes to language. Yeah, I think that yeah, and there's two things there before I talk about the communication supports that I think are really interesting. One, and of course, there's a degree of self-selection when it comes to this, but the writers who I work with, who have come to me because they're interested in poetry, right? I would say 95% of them are hyperlexical, so that they not only have a larger vocabulary than I do, but they also know multiple languages. So there's that incredible paradox, right? Compared to how we've been taught through that nonverbal lens. But then there's also this thing on top of it, which is really extraordinary, which is a deep lyricality. And I feel like that is something that, that poetry helps kind of bring that alive for other people, because, and I feel like this is a very good crossover with communication supports, because I have a lot of writers that I work with who their writing is extremely slow, right? They are, in some cases, using a letterboard and either using their finger or using a pencil backwards to indicate letter by letter with a laminated letterboard held up in front of them, or a stenciled letterboard that they actually go through the letters to make it more clear. You're talking about one letter every 5 seconds or something like that, and then there's sometimes they will hit between, or the whole process can take, even for a short poem, like a haiku length poem, can take 10 or 20 minutes just to not to think it, just to write it, and because they usually have thought the whole thing beforehand often. But what I love to see is a line can take a very long time, and then the second line comes and there's this like an internal rhyme somewhere, or there's something else. There's all this like lyrical information that is being sustained through all of that sensory motor challenge and effort. And to me, that's what's even more exciting or improbable than the hyperlexical nature, is that like to be able to keep the sound of what you want through all of that. And like, it's remarkable. I think one of the, right now is, there's so much more available to non-speaking autistic individuals than there was 10 years ago. And that's because the methods have kind of proliferated. There are several different methods. Some of them are spelling. Spell to communicate is one of them. And we partner with an organization called CIIS, the International Association for Spelling as Communication. And we do a monthly open mic online with non-speaking or unreliably speaking individuals. We usually get we get 100 people in the event, and then we get 20 writers and songwriters sharing stuff, and it's amazing. But so spelling in the way that I kind of just outlined, and that's related to, it's a variation in some ways of the rapid prompting method that was kind of famously devised by Soma Mukhopadhyay in relationship with her son Tito, who's an amazing non-speaking writer. And then there's I think a really interesting kind of spectrum of assisted typing. And what I love about not only having multiple methods, but also having gotten to the point where people can kind of wayfare and try to figure out what actually works for me, what works for me in a sensory motor way. And then within that method, how do I make it mine? So that I think, it used to be that methods were kind of airtight because of how much prejudice they were facing. And I think now people find a little bit more flexibility so that they can make it their own and can actually find this is the way for me within this method that works best. And yeah, so it's remarkable. It's remarkable, especially when you get in a room of non-speakers who are all utilizing different methods at different speeds with different little variations. I mean, it's its own really amazing kind of diversity within neurodiversity.
Hmm. Yes, lovely. And speaking of, speaking of neurodiversity, obviously, you came into this, as you said, not really knowing anything about autism. And so, it's a discovery process. It's very different from, someone who comes in as someone who's been trained in sort of the mainstream academic and professional discourse on autism, and might come in with a lot of terrible preconceptions about autistic limitations.
Exactly.
And you get to come in, just learning from the reality of the people you're working with, which is beautiful. And you don't come in with any preconceived limitations, since no sense that, oh, these people are going to be limited in this particular way. And I think that clearly opened up this beautiful realm of possibility. Now, to the best of my knowledge, you're not autistic yourself, but you are neurodivergent in some way. Yes, you're not entirely neurotypical either. So I'm very curious about that, and about what sort of self-knowledge you've gained doing this work.
Yeah. I was first diagnosed with ADHD when I was 17.
Mhm.
And it was clear throughout my childhood that I was different, and I was what people sometimes call twice exceptional. Although I really love to now challenge that with these non-speaking autistic writers I work with, who are deeply twice exceptional, if you want to go by that rubric. But yeah, I was the kind of kid who did well in school when I was focused, but I also would burst out singing in the middle of class without realizing I was doing it. And I would, I get the report cards were always like, "We love Chris, but it is very hard to have him in class." and yeah, and it was interesting because all the hyperactivity kind of dropped out when I went through puberty, and so it was much easier for me to mask. And I had gone through some social upheaval where people had decided I needed to be taught how the pain of social relations, what that entails. And so I'd grown pretty adept at seeming neurotypical. And also, with that diagnosis, ADHD, at the time where I got it, you just told you have a deficit and a disorder, and there's no community that of to receive you. There's no way to think about it at that time, where it felt like, oh, I could really run with this. When I love your suggestion of the kinetic cognitive style, or cognitive kinetic style. I can't remember.
Kinetic cognitive, yeah.
Yeah, okay. And I think, because that's such a good, I identify with that so strongly.
Yeah, someone just asked me during a talk one time during the Q&A, they were like,
Yeah.
is there a non-pathologizing way to talk about ADHD without all these, because it's got like deficit and disorder in it. So pathologizing, is there a non-pathologizing term? And I just kind of pulled that off the top of my head, kinetic cognitive style, and it's touching on.
Absolutely. And and I love how that also dovetails with what we're learning about autism, and how much of a sensory motor, how that complexity is so expressive of what an autistic life looks like and feels like and moves like. So the kinetic part of it, I think, is so important. And then as I got older and got out of college and started to teach, and I was glad that I had the diagnosis because I was finding myself so drawn towards these particular students, and it helped to know that, we had this degree of fellowship to begin with,
Mhm.
right? And so what's been just beyond joyful and healing is to constantly deepen those relationships with others who are neurodivergent in different ways, and then allow that to deepen my own relationship with neurodivergence. And I have, Mark E.T., who's one of the main writers I feature in this book, has been in many ways my greatest mentor along these lines, and has been pushing me over the years to think a little harder about the ways in which my neurodivergence might surface. And so I would say that I'm definitely not autistic, and and I've gone through some processes that back that up, and I'm still trying to kind of figure out what that means to me and how it works for me. Now, one of the things that, and that's actually my next book, is thinking through all this stuff. It's called Becoming Otherwise.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah, and it's very exciting. I mean, I love it, and and beyond all else, I just love the community I've found and the kinds of ways in which we can interact. I mean, when I get together with my non-speaking autistic friends, everything else, just all that weight falls away. All the masking, all the armor. It's just like we can be with each other exactly with all of who we are, and that feels so good. And I think that one of the other writers that's featured, Aman Bukela, she wrote this poem where she talked about tilted thinking, and I was immediately like, "Ooh, that has frisson for me. I like that." And so I asked her to kind of talk about it more with me, and we both got really excited about this idea of tilted thinkers, and as that is kind of a way of like just stepping outside of the language, the medical language and the diagnostic language, and how, if we're going to invent this for ourselves, what does it sound like? What does it look like? And so that idea of being a tilted thinker is very strong for me. And it's very exciting to build community around that, even just our little kind of set. Yeah.
Beautiful, beautiful. I love it. I love it. You talked about autistic lyricality, and that really resonates with me. And I see that with just autistic writers in general. And there's this whole there really is like a lot. So there's so much non-speaking autistic poetry, and then even the prose writing, like Tito Mukhopadhyay's prose, is extremely lyrical, so sensory rich, and such a beautiful, unique, distinctive way of relating to language. Really, the language has a feel to it. But then also speaking autistics as well, I see, because there's this whole emerging genre of autistic speculative fiction too, and Dora Raymaker's books, Hoshi and the Red Sea Circuit and Resonance, Ada Hoffman's trilogy, The Outside, and the follow-up, the books that follow The Outside. And there's this whole a real sort of emerging renaissance of autistic speculative fiction, particularly queer autistic speculative fiction. I mean, my own fiction writing and comic writing is part of that as well. And I see that same lyricism there, and it looks a little different, but there is this this way of relating to the beauty of language and the patterns in language and the musicality of it, and this search for how do we precisely express sensory experiences that were not shared by the people who developed the language in the first place.
Yeah.
And how do you twist and tilt and play with language to do that? And it's just lovely to see it happen. And the I think I'm really fascinated by the range there. And of course, it's a bit of a cliche to talk about autism as a spectrum. I kind of hate that term in a way, because people use it in a very pathologizing way. But I hear people use on the spectrum as a euphemism because they think it's shameful to say autistic. But there is this vast spectrum of experience and yet these commonalities. And I think that's fascinating to me. I'm curious about what common themes you see emerge in the writing of the autistic poets and writers you work with. Like, what are the themes and patterns? What are the things where, like, if you encountered the work of a non-speaking autistic poet you never encountered before, for instance, like what are the things where you'd be like, I bet this is an autistic poem? What are the distinctive qualities from your experience?
I've never thought about that. I'd be really curious to do that challenge. I remember in grad school getting an MFA where we'd always do one workshop where no one put their names on things, and you always just knew who was whose for the most part. Yeah, it's a really good question, and you're right. The range is astounding. It's one of the reasons I got really excited about this book and about what it might do in the world, because I felt like I was just, every single session I was working with a writer, they would bring out something just so vibrant and so different than the other person. And non-speaking autistic writers are so used to being the exception, of having to represent all non-speaking autistic writers and people who, still wield this outrageous organized prejudice against non-speaking autistic writers will attack them one at a time, right? And so one of the things that seemed so exciting to me was, well, what if I can bring them all together into this book and do these close readings of their work, and people can see, like, oh my goodness, like each one of these writers is doing something that I've never seen before, and it's utterly different from this other writer. That they are, I would say they're in some ways the only thing that goes across the board would be just breaking the rules, but in many cases disregarding the rules. It's just kind of like, and that's where it's like most fluid, I think, is when the writers are just like, listen, I'm not really interested in devoting any energy to what rules language have. Just it's how I feel it should be used, and the patterns I feel like it should, like what carries the internal rhythms of my own thought. But there is some interesting subject matter. I will always find these little crossovers where at one point I got really excited because I noticed that almost every writer I'd worked with had a poem about volcanoes. Or like lava. So I wonder, should I read a couple just so you can see these two poems, or hear these two poems? And
Yeah, I was warned going into the interview that audiences generally don't like it when authors read aloud from their books, but in this case, I think reading a couple of the poems, is different from reading your words. So let's do that.
Totally. I'll read a couple short
Let's
ones.
just let's disregard the rules.
Yeah, that's what we got to do. All right. So one of these writers I haven't mentioned yet is Sid Ghosh. That's Ghosh. Sid is a non-speaking autistic writer from Portland who also has Down syndrome. Sid was only 14 when he wrote this. Sid is kind of beyond the beyond, a real, and this is another thing that comes up, is that I work with a lot of adults, and I want to make sure that that's known, right? Because often when we think about it, autism in general, but especially non-speaking autism, we just think of kids. There's this infantilization, right? But there are some very young non-speaking writers who are phenomenal. And so Sid is one of those. And he wrote a poem called Volcanic Mind. Humming friends, torque screw language into my mining mind. Mind secretes modes of intense lava. Lava makes own path. Fire forges mind. To think mind is hot is to hammer bones with air. So that's Sid's poem, which Sid is always blowing me away. And then a poem that was written collaboratively by Mark and Max Eady, who are siblings. There's a word in here that will help to know, and it's alapa, which is actually what they've named one of the nonprofit organizations that they've started. But alapa is the underlying rhythmic structure of a raga. So this is called A Volcano Named E.T. A volcano named E.T., their last name, erupts inside our bellies at the sound of a pattern, family members' pattern of joy or pattern of worry. We experience synchronous and asynchronous changes, good and bad, heavy and light. We laugh like the alapa pattern, starting at our heads and ending at our toes. We scream when it rocks our bellies, like the pattern of a song, pattern of drumming, a lapa pattern of emotional pain. We feel the joy and pain in our alapa bodies, all over our navels, all over almost everything. So there you have three very different poets. And utilizing the metaphor of the volcano in totally different ways. But, and I've talked about this with other non-speaking autistic writers, there is this inherent metaphor of interiority bursting forth, right? That there's a lot going on that will need to erupt at some point or other. And if you can hopefully come to that conclusion early and find some channels for that, then things are going to be a lot better.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think it's one of the I want to get back to something you talked about earlier about masking, because I don't know, in case the audience is unfamiliar, I'll say, masking is passing, essentially. It's learning to perform neurotypicality. So it's performing in neurotypicality. So for an autistic person or other neurodivergent person to act like they're not autistic, to try to imitate the embodiment and social style of a non-autistic person, essentially to hide who they are, to be in the closet in order to avoid the sort of abuse and exclusion and such that autistic people encounter in the world. Very much like being in the closet, passing. So many oppressed minority groups over the years have found some equivalent of, like, some of us can hide and find it safer to hide and pass for a member of the dominant majority. And there's this very interesting division in the autistic community, because autistic people who can speak are pushed relentlessly to mask. They're pushed relentlessly, and subjected to these, like behavioral therapies that are extremely abusive and trauma inducing to, it force autistic people to mask. And it's like to get around in the world, to hold a job, whatever. It's like one is expected to mask and hide being autistic and act like a non-autistic person. And I write about that in my own work a lot, about unmasking and embracing autistic embodiment and autistic modes of sociality and being, and to drop all of the tension and physical armoring that one has to put on to mask. And the then the non-speaking autistic people are not pushed to mask in the same way, because people give up on them. People decide, oh, they're never going to hold a job. They're never going to have friends. They're just in their own little world. They're disconnected from everyone. They have a very limited intellect or no self-awareness. And so nobody bothers trying to make them mask, because they assume that they'll never be able to participate meaningfully in the non-autistic world at all. And that is, which is terrible, and of course, in the ableist world, the non-speaking autistics get called low functioning, as if making noises with your mouth is the highest function of a human being. And then autistics who can speak are called high functioning and held to very different standards.
Yeah.
Right. So I discovered when I started this process for myself of unmasking and of letting myself move like an autistic person, recovering my autistic embodiment, my autistic style, and just letting myself be flamingly autistic. What I found is that it opened up cognitive capacities and creative capacities that I'd cut myself off from by masking. That it was like I couldn't be my full creative self without being my full autistic self. And so I'm wondering, for the non-speaking autistics who haven't received the same pressure to mask, does that, you think that's help to leave their creativity unhindered as well?
Well, it's a fascinating question. And I would say, one, yes. I mean, I think that I feel like it's incalculable how much time those of us who can or might pass, and actually everyone, spends on learning the ways they should be in the world, and the ways they should talk, and the ways they should write, and the ways they should stand. And there's just so much energy poured into that could be poured into all these other things, that it's just mind-blowing to think about. And so I think you're right, in a very real sense, that not speaking autistics who have not gotten caught in the gravity of that, because they've been thought uncatchable to some degree, are have put that energy into different things, into different stores of creative output. And what is also really fascinating to me, and in writing this new book, I've been thinking about it a lot, is how it doesn't mean non-speaking autistic people avoid the capture of all of the normative pressures, right? I have a writer that I'm very close with who could never be captured by neurotypicality. But the very first poem that they ever wrote with me had a very like heteronormative
Mhm.
vibe to it. And I was like, okay, that's, I mean, it's age appropriate, I guess. That's what's going on. I get it. And I even then, it's something like felt a little false to me, felt a little performative. And as we got to know each other, at some point, I brought up asexuality, and I can't remember what was the context for it, but the writer was like, "Wait, I I could be that?" And I was like,
Hmm.
"Yeah, for sure you could be that." And they were like, "Oh yeah, well that's what I am." And I was like, "Well, that's really interesting because that first poem you wrote, felt really performative in this other direction." They were like, "Oh yeah, I was just trying to fit in and like, trying to meet expectations." And so you have this
Right.
person who, in one ways, avoids the capture, in other ways, is completely captured until they see that there are alternatives, right? So it's really fascinating to me that none of us is immune. We're all intersectionally being like the capture is attempted on intersectional levels all the time. And so you may be very free in one sense and then totally closeted in another sense. And but I do think that as you do like lean into the liberatory feeling of of you know of letting go of that armor, of letting go of those masks, you do find it's like, well, maybe it's not just that I'm neurodivergent, maybe I can't really in any good faith like subscribe to being like straight. Like, what does that even mean to me anymore, other than I'm going to agree to buy into this system that I know is incredibly like violent and coercive. And so I do love seeing how all of those things start to kind of blossom and open up together, those questionings. And I think that there's something about autistic experience, thinking, embodiment that really lends itself to that, that intersectionally liberated thinking. And that
Yes.
it's something that makes me really excited about the ways in which autistic writers and thinkers can be leaders as we move into what is hopefully like a new paradigm for all of human culture.
Yes. Yes. Beautiful. And I certainly have experienced this firsthand. I mean, I think that and in my of course I write about neuroqueering and this whole idea that uh, heteronormativity and sort of compulsory heteronormativity is inextricably entwined with compulsory neuronormativity, the
Yeah,
performance of heteronormativity and heteronormative, binary gender roles is really inseparable from the performance of neurotypicality and
yeah,
of it's uh, a very high proportion of autistic people are transgender too, compared to non-autistic people. Like
and
it's
including
very.
non-speaking autistic people. I work with several transgender non-speaking autistic writers.
Mhm. And my experience, just general, yeah, having after like 2 decades of being involved in autistic community and culture, I what I see is autistic people who are like wildly spectacularly queer,
Yeah,
very gender nonconforming, queer in all kinds of exciting ways. Um, and then those who are performing heteronormativity in so strongly that it's very clearly like kind of a desperate act,
yeah,
like something they're doing because they were pressured or abused into it in childhood, which
yeah.
was my experience as well. I mean, come out as trans very late in life. I'm at the very early stages of gender transition. It's not even visible yet, and so that's it's like I'm going to spend my 50s uh transitioning, and that's and it's fascinating. There was this huge gap, there's like a very long gap between me coming out as autistic and coming out as trans. So I sort of thought I'd done all the coming out I needed to do. I think, okay, I'm queer and autistic, and that's like established that really young. And then it's a big surprise. And it was very much a result of dropping this ongoing unmasking process of dropping the performance of compulsory neurotypicality, discovering my autistic embodiment. Like, when I got far enough with that process, I had to start dropping the fake masculine embodiment I'd been brutally trained to do in childhood. And so now it's like, whoa, okay, here I am, like, oh, look, I'm trans as well. And I just see so much of that.
Flamingly autistic, like, I feel like that's one thing, and this may feel like a somewhat, I don't know, insignificant word, but to me it's really crucial, is exuberance.
Mm-hmm.
There's something about autistic exuberance that really meets queer exuberance, that really meets trans exuberance, that really, like, all of those things, disabled exuberance. And I think that like, maybe if you're a boy, right, you can be exuberant, but by the time you're a man, you're not really allowed to be exuberant in that way. You're not allowed to bubble up. And so you see how those all come together. And then also, I think that's where it meets liberatory thinking so strongly, because you think about, like, Tony K. Bambara, and, like, we have to make the revolution irresistible. Like, to me, that's what the exuberance embodies. It's like, yes, I want that. Like, that person is experiencing joy. That person is, like, radiating joy. I want some of that. Like, and so I feel like there's something about exuberance that has always been, and I think it's drawn me into the work too. It's like, I love this person. Like, this person is bringing me so much joy to be around, and it is very contagious, the exuberance.
Yeah, no, I agree. Joyfulness is revolutionary in a way. And the autistic joy of, like, finding joy in, language and the sensory experience, and ooh, this texture here, and ooh, volcanoes, and ooh, trains, and just oh, this gesture, ooh, moving my hand like this feels so good. There's this I think it's revolutionary in the sense that, as you say, often we're trained, as part of neuronormative and heteronormative performance, not to express joy and exuberance, and not to, thou shalt not delight in the tactile and the olfactory and such.
Totally. Yeah.
But also it's revolutionary because we're in this consumer society where the sort of the market forces tell us what we should want, what we should desire, what we need to consume. And it's like, if you can find absolute naked joy in running your fingers over particular surfaces, and playing with running water, like, you're pretty hard to market to, because you so easily find joy in the everyday. And I think that that's in such a heavily consumer society, that's revolutionary. Like, I can find all of this joy without buying a product.
Totally. Yeah, there's that book, How to Do Nothing, by Jenny Odell, right, a Bay Area writer. And that idea of, like, the subtitle is like, resisting the attention economy. It's like, who resists the attention economy better than statistics, right? Like, and also that idea, I think attention is so important, right? Because the ways in which autistic attention, I mean, luckily, now I know from personal experience and being with people, that it's so inclusive of the environment, right? And the more than human world. And I think that, and of course, there's lots of like neuroscience to back this up, but in just my own experience of it and the writing that these writers do, you can tell that their attention is immersed in like natural forms, in what Adam Wolfond, one of my favorite writers, calls the atmospheres, you know, and that there is a participatory, like revolutionarily participatory aspect of that, right? To say, you know, when I write with the atmospheres. When I dance with the wind. When I'm outside, I hear the language of leaves, as Hannah Emerson writes. You know, it's like all of these things, you know, just escape the attention economy altogether, or reinvent it.
Oh, absolutely. And that brings me to something I wanted to ask about, ask you to riff off of a little bit, which is the title of the book, May Tomorrow Be Awake, because that you were talking about that, and that immediately, like as you talked about this, you know, just now, about that exuberance and that you know, that dancing with the atmospheres, and like that, I flashed to the title, May Tomorrow Be Awake. Like, I want to hear where that title came from and what it means to you.
Yeah, I mean, so we just had the launch for the book locally a couple days ago, and I got to I got to read from the book and share some work from Mark and Max E.T., who live here locally, and then do a Q&A with Mark. And the book, the May Tomorrow Be Awake, is from Mark's poem, from the third poem that Mark ever wrote. So in some ways, you could even call it the second poem Mark ever wrote. The first one, we just like established, one, that we could like find something together, and two, that Mark was ready, was going to go for it. And so the first chapter of the book talks about the first like full poem that Mark wrote, and then you have to wait until the last chapter to get the second one, and the second one is the poem that has May Tomorrow Be Awake in it. And yeah, and this notion, there's a couple different aspects of it. One, of course, you can think about the kinds of stupor that proliferate through the attention economy, through capitalism, through all these normative forces, where we slumber on we talk about the real world, like, but that's not the real world. Like, the real world, the way we talk about it, is actually the world of dreams and stupors. And to awaken out of that to what is actually happening in the world, what's actually alive in the world, is I think what a lot of people are doing right now. And I think the pandemic sped that process up. One author I think about a lot is Robin Wall Kimmerer, and her book Braiding Sweetgrass, that I think has helped so many people realize how to rekindle a relationship to the more than human world. And I think that that's part of the awakeness of tomorrow. But one of the things that Mark also means when he uses that is to be awake to each other. And that's part of the, you know, the subtitle, right? Our neurodiverse future, which is, I feel like with speaking with you, it's funny because people think about it as like a revolutionary idea. And I love that, like, I can always be like, listen, it's neurodiverse whether you want it to be or not. It's all right. We're living in the neurodiverse present. That term just describes the way that all our brains are.
Right. Humanity is neurodiverse. We just are
neurodiverse, right? So that's, I kind of slipped this title that everyone thinks is like out there, but it's really just like, no, we're already there. But Mark is actually really focused on that. And you know, when he and his sibling founded their first nonprofit, what they wanted to do and are continuing to do is create a neurodiverse living community that has all kinds of services, most of them artistic, and that creates housing for people. And Mark has been really insistent on everything being neurodiverse from the beginning, and gets really frustrated when he's in a room with a bunch of other people and they're just like, like looking to him to kind of ideate everything, and or leaving him completely out of it. It feels like a very black and white thing sometimes. And he's like, no, we actually have to figure out how to do this together. Like, we need to figure out how to be awake together. Not we take turns being awake, not like we do it, we just follow the autistic person because that's like the PC way to do it. Not, we follow the neurotypical person because they can navigate the neurotypical world. It's like we have to actually figure out how to do this together. And so I think that, and what you'll find in the book is that Mark's poem, he edited it with his sibling Max, and then they wrote annotations to it, which are really amazing. And so you'll see the scope of that vision of may tomorrow be awake, everything it holds.
Oh, beautiful. I want to clarify for the audience here about the terminology. We're going to move on to Q&A soon, but I want to clarify something for the audience about this word neurodiverse. So a person who is not neurotypical, who is not performing, with neuronormativity, a person who's not neurotypical is neurodivergent. So when we talk about autistic people, kinetic cognitive people, people with Down syndrome, we're talking about neurodivergent people. Neurodiverse, the human species is neurodiverse the same way it's ethnically diverse and culturally diverse. Like there's no human being who's not a part of the spectrum of human cultural diversity, right? There's no person who doesn't have, who's completely outside of culture, unless they're, feral and raised by wolves or something. Everyone's part of the spectrum of cultural diversity. Everyone is part of the spectrum of human neurodiversity. So we're a neurodiverse species. When we talk about a neurodiverse classroom or a neurodiverse organization, that means an organization that's made up of lots of different people with different body minds and different neurocognitive styles. There's no such thing as a neurodiverse person, and that's a misuse of the term that I see a lot in corporate culture these days. Yeah. It's sort of part of the neoliberal corporate thing of using diverse as a euphemism for marginalized.
Right.
But
what do you think, just before we get to the Q&A, what do you think as we push for, like, talk about liberatory, like one of the things I'm really interested in this next book, and that's why I put some many as one of the pronouns, is like, if we can start to break down this concept of the individual, right, and kind of show how every person is a composition of forces and selves and identifications, I wonder if neurodiverse then actually becomes appropriate again in this weird way if you go far enough, because the individual is multiple, and then could an individual be neurodiverse?
Well, the individual still has one nervous system.
Okay.
But I think there's something, it's sort of what I'm getting at with the concept of neuroqueering. I think there's this capacity to play with our neuroplasticity, I think, is underexplored. That the fact that we can, and for me, it's part of my, I come to this from a Zen background of like experiencing everything as, everything's a flow, everything's a process, sort of a sense of the impermanence of things. And so in a sense, a person is just a locus of experience, and identity and cognition and all of that are ever shifting. And I think that this is why I kind of push back against the idea of neurotypes, the idea, or the idea of, I mean, autism has been a useful category for understanding people, but I think that it's important to push back against the tendency to just put people in boxes, because I think identity is always fluid, and the self is always fluid, and we are able to be more free and joyful and creative if we allow that to happen and don't try to nail ourselves down or other people.
Yeah, or police the borders, right?
Right, exactly. Yes, beautiful. Well, we should probably go to the Q&A now because there's questions accumulating here. And let's see. Okay, so first question here. This one's addressed to me, but we can both answer it. Dear Dr. Nick Walker, would you be so kind to share your honest thoughts, feelings about how we can change the way we view and talk about autistic people moving forward? How we can change the way we view and talk about autistic people moving forward, and how we can systemically integrate neurodiversity. Yeah, I would say I'm going to start with the second part first and talk about systemic integration, and that really I talk about this in my book, so I'm mostly going to recommend looking there. I say that the goal of working towards the shift to a neurodiversity paradigm, the goal is what I call neurocosmopolitanism. And cosmopolitanism is an approach to cultural diversity that says there's no normal culture, there's no right culture, there's just cultural diversity, and we can embrace cultural diversity, and every culture can learn from every other culture and form these hybridities and creative fusions and syntheses, and people can sort of partake fluidly of culture without, it's sort of the opposite. Cosmopolitanism is very much the opposite of nationalism. You see this rise in response to the anxiety of changing times. We're seeing a rise in white supremacist ethno-nationalism and such, and people rigidly clinging to a particular national cultural identity in ways that become desperate and violent. And the opposite is this cosmopolitan embrace of cultural diversity and fluidity. And so neurocosmopolitanism is the same thing in relation to neurodiversity. There is no normal kind of mind, and we can learn from each other. And I think this is why I'm very excited about your work, Chris, because I think your work is very much an example of a neurocosmopolitan work, that this is not you helping these poor unfortunate souls, these poor people who they can't even speak, and it's not a top-down thing. You're in the room collaborating with them, and everyone's learning from each other, and everybody's consciousness and cognitive style is getting influenced by everyone else's. So that I think is what the integration looks like. It really involves this mutual respect and eliminating the privileging of the normal.
For sure. And I think that it again gets back to that idea of what is irresistible. And I think that one of the things I hope this book does, and then the books that these writers who are in the book have and will publish, that one of the things that's just been this completely unexpected, what feels like a blessing of this work, is that the writing that these people bring to the world is so amazing. That it exists fully fledged as art itself in the world, and it's already like making waves that way. But you have this other side of it, which is it's just inherent advocacy. It does this amazing advocacy work without having to like envelop everything in the language of advocacy. It just does it on its own without having to like contextualize that for other people. And not that it's wrong to contextualize it sometimes, but one of the things I hope is that people will read and I know it's like the first book in our multiverse series. I'll show you Hannah Emerson's The Kissing of Kissing. This book, I've heard from so many people, like, you know, I will not be humble about it because I feel the same way. It's changed their lives. I think this is one of the best books that's been written this century. And I think that people who encounter it are opened up by it in this way that changes how they would ever relate to another autistic person, much less a non-speaking autistic person. There's this inherent generosity to it. There's the teachings that are inherent to it are so strong that people are awakened, right? Because that's the thing. That's the paradox is it's not, we don't need to awaken non-speaking autistic people. We actually need to awaken the neurotypical people. And that's what's going to happen. They were always awake. They just needed some communication supports. And so, yeah, I think that that's how we do it, is we just keep putting the work out there in the world that changes people.
It's beautiful, beautiful. I'll briefly address the other piece of that question, which is how can we change the way we talk, we view and talk about autistic people moving forward? And because I'm an Aikido teacher and a Zen practitioner, I tend to think of this work, I'm coming from a different place from like a lot of the work around neurodiversity and such comes from a social justice activism direction, and comes from a academically is very much around, say, critical disability studies and such. And I like it, your work, Chris, is different. It's poetic work, and that has a different sort of effect in the world and a different stance of just where we're here to create poetry, but it has, as you said, it has intrinsically a transformative effect culturally. Yeah. Because of what it is by its nature. For me, because so much of my life is immersed in mindfulness practices like Aikido and like Zen, I tend to approach everything thinking in terms of mindfulness as a mindfulness teacher and mindfulness practitioner, which is a very different approach from, say, a disability studies approach or a social justice activism approach. And so to me, it really is about a mindfulness practice of catching our assumptions. And to me, it rests very similar to, if I'm sitting zazen, I'm meditating and I'm focused on my breath and my thoughts start to wander, I catch myself and I bring my attention back to my breath. And that's the whole practice. And there's something like that about catching oneself slipping into these neuronormative assumptions. So how we talk about autistic people, there's a very simple guideline, and it's not simple to practice. It's just simple to articulate. The simple guideline is, would you talk about another oppressed group this way? And what I find is that, what I see in classrooms, as a psychology professor, is that, in textbooks and in lectures and such, often people talk about, you get academics talking about autistic people and professionals talking about autistic people in a way where if you talked about another oppressed minority group like that, you would be in big trouble. You'd be facing disciplinary action from your college if you talked about like gay people or a racial minority group in this way. And yet it's acceptable to talk about autistic people that way still. And so run it through that filter of, you know, what does that mean? If you say something like high functioning autistic people, what does that mean? Would you talk about a gay person who acted straight and stayed in the closet as a high functioning gay person, as a gay person who's out of the closet more, a low functioning gay person? Like, what do you mean by functioning?
Yeah.
And, I mean, there's still people who use person first language, who say people with autism. When you say people with homosexuality, it would be very obviously outing yourself as a homophobe, I think, if you talked about gay people as people with homosexuality. So I think running it through that filter is a mindfulness practice of learning to catch yourself. Whoa, what's about to come out of my mouth? And would I really talk that way about a member of some other group? And how would I feel about being talked about this way? So yeah, that's my sense of how to make that shift.
Very helpful.
All right, let's look at the second question here. How do you give editorial feedback to the writers you feature? How do you seek to support the development of their art? That's a great question for you, Chris.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things that I was learning, even when I started to write this book, was how to step back further and further in that role. And luckily, I think I learned a lot of lessons by the time that we started Multiverse. But, I would say that especially when I first start working with a writer, the first 3 months, 6 months is just about me studying how they use language without getting in the way of it at all. I don't attempt to correct anything. I don't try to normalize anything. What I try to do is figure out, how is this person using language? What are the patterns inherent to their way of languaging? And how can I help them carry that to their readers? So how can we make sure that on the page, those rhythms, those patterns are as present as possible, and that the how of the poem communicates itself as strongly as the what? And then when it comes to the editorial work that I do at Multiverse, I'm not only stepping back from it, especially if we publish a writer that I've worked with through unrestricted interest, then I'm explicitly not their editor at Multiverse. We bring in one, often multiple, sometimes a whole host of editors. Adam decided he wanted his book edited by Disassembly, this neurodiverse arts collective in Toronto. And well, it's actually global, and I'm honored to be a part of it. But so Adam had, like 24 people editing his book, and all weighing in. Now, in the end, the important thing to understand is that Adam is the one who edits Adam's book. Adam makes all the decisions about every single piece of language in that book. So, but he welcomes. He's really excited about collaboration, and so. Writers, what they want to support the development of their art is very different, writer to writer. And so my job is just to recognize what is already happening there, get out of the way with it, get out of the way of it, and support it making its way to readers. And often that involves a lot of really exciting conversations with the writers about the form and about the design and about all these other things. And the collaborative work couldn't be more fun and exciting to do.
Beautiful. All right. Question. Can you share your thoughts on autistic representations in popular literature, like the Curious Incident and the Dog of the Nighttime? Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime. Yeah. Okay. So autistic representations in popular literature.
Yeah. I mean, I think the first thing is there just one autistic person? Because if there is, then you have a very limited representation. And I also think that you're missing out, because when autistic people get together, really exciting things happen. And I think you also get to revel in the range, in the soundscape, in the movement scape that gets created when a bunch of autistic and neurodivergent people get together. And when you just have one, it's not only creating an inherent prejudice around the identity because people walk away from it thinking, oh, that's an autistic person, but it also just misses like all this amazing stuff that could be there, that could bubble up.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful, yes. And I think you look at something like the curious incident of the dog in the nighttime, and that's I mean, I think that book is complete garbage. And it's you're looking at an autistic person who is completely, you know, just a stereotype. You know, it's written by a non-autistic person, and it's based on the worst mainstream stereotypes of autistic people, and on the worst sort of academic misinformation, like the shoddy scholarship of Simon Baron-Cohen at Cambridge, who says autistic people, you know, lack theory of mind and lack empathy and lack imagination. And obviously, you read Chris's book, and read the poets he works with, and or read, from the emerging genre of autistic speculative fiction and such, or look at even autistic, celebrities who are out as autistic, like Anthony Hopkins or David Byrne. And like I would say, imagination is vivid imagination is maybe one of the defining traits of being autistic. And there's this curious incident, and books like that work with this stereotype of autistic people that's completely divorced from what actual autistic people are like. You can tell the authors never had a conversation with like a real autistic person, except as a research subject or something, or they've never opened their mind up and done the work that Chris does all the time of like letting themselves learn from real autistic people. And I think what happens is there's this piling up of stereotypes, because people these days try to write autistic characters, non-autistic authors try to write autistic characters, and
they're based on the other one.
They're based it on the other stereotypes. They base it on people inspired by Curious Incident. And so there's this growing separation of the popular cultural autistic and the real autistic, and they're getting further and further apart. And then we see in academic work, like we see like Ian McGilchrist's recent book, The Master and His Emissary, about the functioning of the brain and imagination and the relation between the right and left hemispheres. And he had some interesting things to say, but he uses autistic people as an example of the unimaginative and what happens when a person is completely left brain and lacking in creativity, and it undermines his entire argument. It's this massive tome that could be so good, but he undermines himself by getting autism completely backward.
Yeah. And I've seen that with like V.S. Ramachandran too. I've seen like a lot of academics
have
these great ideas. And I would say that all of these questions actually are related so far, in that, the best thing you can do is actually develop an authentic relationship with an autistic person, or two, 3, or 4. And I think that that's one of the things that to me is so revolutionary, is not invisibilizing difference, acknowledging difference, and then connecting across difference, as like Audre Lorde, emphasized so much, is that, and that's, to me, that's the true revolutionary quality of neurodiversity, is that this idea that when we come together and form these authentic connections across difference, the complementarity creates these like exponential potential for like imagination, for new worlds, for like, that's really get it. It's not where it's like the person next to you. It's like, go as far as you can. And obviously the same is true across any intersectional identity. Like,
Right.
yeah,
And that's exactly what I mean by neurocosmopolitanism
yeah,
there too.
exactly.
That
Yeah,
neurocosmopolitanism is a source of creative synergy. You know, this is about it's not just it. Part of it is you bring a lot of different minds and perspectives to bear on a given, a lot of different perspectives to bear on a given problem. You'll have more solutions to draw from. But more importantly, there's a synergy where stuff is generated that wouldn't have been generated by any individual there. It's in
exactly.
the interaction of different minds, and that can, as you say, that communication across differences, that's where the magic happens. And I see that really missed. I see that with people who have kind of appropriated the term neurodiversity, but are still operating in the old pathology paradigm of autism, like the Stanford Neurodiversity Project. I don't know if you know that, but like, it's terrible. It's this like Stanford Neurodiversity Project, Stanford University. It's entirely run by non-autistic people, all neurotypical run, and it's so much of it is about like how can the tech industry exploit autistic labor, and it's so much about it's so top down. It's so like, what can we do for autistic people, bring them into corporate culture at the bottom, always supervised by non-autistic people. There's nothing collaborative about it. There's nothing. It's like they're missing 99% of the creative potential of neurodiversity by just focusing on how can we find individual autistic people and exploit their cognitive labor.
Yeah.
Okay, we got one more question, and I think it's a perfect one here for you. I've heard there is a press that specifically focuses on publishing autistic poetry. Any idea what it might be? Any recommended anthologies? As a matter of fact.
Well, I feel like we could both answer this question on certain levels. Yeah, I mean, I think, well, there are a bunch of great anthologies. One of the anthologies I'd like to point to is All the Weight of Our Dreams, which is a great anthology of intersectional autism in writing. There's been anthologies like Typed Words, Loud Voices, that highlights non-speaking and unreliably speaking writers. And then what we're doing with Multiverse out of Milkweed Editions is not strictly publishing autistic poetry. We're thinking much more expansively and intersectionally than that. And so the third writer in the Multiverse series, Jerome Ellis, which is spelled with 5 J's at the start, is an amazing writer who has a glottoblock stutter, and that's an essential component of both his approach to writing and his approach to being. And so his experience of disfluency is this essential part of his artistic practice, and Jerome's been really excited to find family among other disfluent writers, and thinking about non-speaking writers as disfluent and as a part of that lineage. And so I can't say that we're only publishing autistic poetry, because we really want to be more broad than that, have a broader coalition of writers. But we're publishing a lot of autistic writers. And then Unrestricted Interest has a publishing part of it called Unrestricted Editions, where we publish the work of the writers we work with. I mean, we don't publish outside of that, so it's not a regular publishing, press, but yeah.
And Multiverse is an imprint of Milkweed Editions, is that right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So that's the one. I think that's where I send people now, because I'm managing editor of Autonomous Press, and we publish a lot of autistic speculative fiction and autistic literature, but we don't publish poetry collections. And so when we get contacted by autistic poets, we send them to you.
Yep.
I point them
One
towards
thing
multiverse.
people should know is that multiverse. We're given the ability to publish 2 books a year.
Oh,
We're already backed up to 2028. So if
wow.
you want to publish autistic poetry, find a way to start another multiverse. We need many of these. We can't just have one. It's just like we were saying about, the single exception or representation of the autistic or non-speaking autistic writer. We need to build lots of these, and hopefully the success of multiverse will help make that possible. Hopefully you can point to multiverse if you're out there and say, this is really working. We need this here at this university or somewhere else, right? So I want to see a proliferation of them.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yes. Renaissance autistic poetry to go with the autistic speculative fiction renaissance that's emerging.
Totally.
Yes. Well, this brings us kind of perfectly to time here, and it's a great note to end on, to say, hey, read and write and publish more autistic poetry, everyone. So, Chris,
Thank
I
you
want
so
to.
much, Nick,
Oh,
for
Chris, thank
your
you.
amazing questions.
It's such a pleasure getting to speak with you. I'm so thrilled by your book, and so thrilled to hear you've got another one in the works. So let's bring back Alex here to our MC to say goodnight. And it's been a pleasure.
Absolutely.
Thank you all so much for joining us today. We hope you'll join us for more of our upcoming talks and workshops. This conversation was recorded, so if you'd like to watch it again or share it with your community, it will be available here on our YouTube channel at this same link and later on our Facebook page. We're also going to feature this talk on our podcast, which you can find at CIISpod.com or by searching CIIS public programs on your favorite podcast app. Thank you again for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of your night.